The cleaning lady cleaned a millionaire's office for years. But what she discovered on her last day at the millionaire's house would change her world forever. In the crisp early morning hours, the grand mansion stood silent, its opulence shadowed by the dim morning light creeping through the thick curtains. Each morning, Rosa slipped through the side door, her footsteps soft and steady, her hands deft with the familiarity of a decade's worth of repetition. The halls, lined with statues that never seemed to catch a layer of dust, shimmered faintly under the chandeliers. They seemed to watch her as she worked, unmoving and indifferent, much like the mansion's owner. She knew every curve and corner of the mansion, the intricate carvings on the balustrade, the soft, muted shades of the Persian rugs. Each room was like an untouched world, beautiful yet lifeless, where she was the only heartbeat. The library smelled of leather and aged wood, its shelves reaching high with books that looked worn but unread. She noticed things that went unseen to others, the faded imprints left by expensive leather loafers, the untouched tea sets and framed photographs that hadn't moved an inch since she started. Rosa was neither young nor old. A quiet woman with a steadfast sense of purpose in each movement. She worked with the sort of dedication only seen in those who viewed their role as more than just a job. It was almost a calling. Diligent and reserved, she moved through the mansion's rooms with a grace born from years of careful routine. Her hands, worn and slightly calloused from decades of labor, bore the marks of her life. A mother who had raised 2 children on her own, a worker who had found solace in her duties. There was something oddly comforting in knowing the ins and outs of someone's home, even if she was a stranger to him. She had learned about him through the artifacts of his life. An untouched gem spoke of abandoned resolutions. A faded family portrait hinted at past relationships that had faded too. But of all the clues, she had never pieced together a complete picture. The few times she'd seen Mr. Graves, he had barely acknowledged her presence. He'd emerge now and then from his study, barely sparing her a glance before disappearing again behind closed doors. He was always immaculately dressed, his suit jackets sharp and dark, his gaze distant, as though perpetually occupied with weighty thoughts. His presence carried a chill, a faint scent of cologne mixed with a metallic note that lingered after he passed, like he was always halfway in another world. To Rosa, he remained a figure in the background, as enigmatic and unreachable as the paintings that adorned the walls. His manner was neither harsh nor kind. It was indifferent. If she entered a room he occupied, he would look through her rather than at her, as though she was part of the decor, a silent, moving fixture in his otherwise orderly world. But over the years, she had become attuned to his patterns, his hours of solitude, the odd phone calls that trailed off when he noticed her nearby, and the collection of objects on his desk that she never dared to touch. For Rosa, he was a mystery she had learned to live alongside, much like the mansion itself. Yet, an unspoken curiosity simmered beneath her steady, observant eyes. She couldn't help but wonder who this man was beyond the suits and grand wealth. As she polished the crystal vases and smoothed the silk pillows, she would sometimes catch a flicker of a thought. Why did a man like him, with all his success, carry such an air of solitude? But it was only a passing curiosity, and she had always been content with her role as the invisible observer. Today was different, and Rosa could feel it from the moment she stepped inside. She moved through the rooms more slowly, letting her hands linger over familiar surfaces and trinkets. Today was her last day in the mansion. She'd given notice 2 weeks earlier. Her decision reached quietly after long contemplation. Her hands were growing tired, her back ached more than it used to. It was time to make peace with leaving this place. As she polished the dining table one last time, she reflected on the memories she'd collected over the years. For a long time, the mansion had been a refuge, a quiet escape from her own, noisier home. The polished marble floors had absorbed her whispers, her sighs of exhaustion, her quiet laughter at the absurdities of life that only she could appreciate in the silent corridors. Despite herself, she felt a strange attachment to the mansion, as if it had silently kept her secrets too. She never belonged here, not truly, but still, the thought of leaving tugged at her. As Rosa dusted the shelves in the library, her fingers drifted over the books one last time. She marveled at the volumes of untold stories and imagined lives within them. One book, however, caught her eye. She hadn't noticed it before, half hidden behind a thick law textbook. A small, dark leather notebook, its cover worn from what seemed like years of handling. For reasons she couldn't quite place, she reached for it, her fingers hesitating on its spine. It opened with the slightest creak, revealing pages filled with a neat, meticulous script. At first, it appeared to be a journal, entries of a life painstakingly captured in ink. She only intended to skim the first few lines, but the words drew her in. The entries were deeply personal, chronicling events and memories that seemed to belong to someone other than the Mr. Graves she knew. There were hints of loneliness, mentions of loved ones who were no longer present. Rosa found herself reading about moments of regret, failures hidden beneath his polished exterior, losses that still haunted him. One page spoke of a daughter, her name written with such care it seemed almost sacred. A wave of recognition washed over her. She recalled a faded photograph she had once dusted in the corner of his study. It was the one personal item on his otherwise empty desk. She'd once glimpsed a girl standing beside him in the photo, her smile warm and radiant, as if unaware of the solemn future that awaited her father. The final few pages of the notebook took on an almost frantic tone, as if the writer were trying to capture a last thread of connection, grasping at memories that were slipping away. Rosa's heart pounded. She had never known this man beyond his reserved manner, yet here was a side of him he had clearly chosen to keep hidden. Why had he left this notebook here so exposed? It felt almost like he wanted it to be found. Rosa closed the notebook slowly, hands trembling. She sat in the stillness of the library, the weight of what she had uncovered pressing on her. For years she had existed on the edges of his life, content in her anonymity. But this notebook held a glimpse into his heart, a heart she had never realized he possessed. She held it close, her mind racing with questions. Who was the man she'd worked for all these years, really? And why did it feel like his story was only just beginning for her? The notebook's revelations cast a new light on everything Rosa thought she knew. On her last day, she couldn't help but recall the subtle, unremarkable moments she'd shared in proximity to Mr. Graves, moments that now seemed laden with an unnoticed meaning. She remembered mornings when she would hear the soft murmur of his voice echoing through the house as he spoke on the phone, his words low and clipped, conveying a quiet sense of urgency. At the time, she'd thought little of it. Now, she wondered if those calls were his way of reaching out, even if only to business associates, to break his solitude. Years of observation had made Rosa keenly aware of the minor details that others might have overlooked. She recalled how his study door always seemed closed when she arrived, but slightly ajar when she left, as if he couldn't bear to completely close himself off. And there were odd moments too, the times she'd find a glass left on the mantelpiece or a scarf draped haphazardly over a chair. A sudden, unexpected messiness in an otherwise perfectly ordered world. There were rare moments when she'd caught a glimpse of something unguarded in him too. Once, years ago, she'd entered the library and found him there, gazing at the same photograph on his desk that she'd noticed all those years. It had been one of the few times he'd seemed startled to see her, eyes widening slightly before he quickly composed himself and excused her. Rosa had thought it strange at the time, but she hadn't questioned it. Now, she wished she had. As she continued her last round of cleaning, Rosa's curiosity grew into something deeper. A kind of kinship she couldn't quite explain. She knew better than to intrude, yet she felt a strange urge to understand what lay behind the cool exterior. Mr. Graves, for all his wealth and power, seemed to be someone who had built walls not only to keep others out, but perhaps to keep parts of himself contained within. That he kept those memories and regrets so carefully guarded struck a chord in her. She'd spent her life caring for others, concealing her own burdens behind a quiet demeanor. Perhaps she and Mr. Graves weren't so different. Rosa remembered the harder years, back when she'd taken on this job to support her family alone, days when she too had felt closed off from the world, doing whatever was necessary to keep herself going. In Mr. Graves' words, she saw faint reflections of her own struggles, the silent pain she had felt but never expressed, the losses she had swallowed and locked away. As she passed through each room, the details took on a new significance. The grand paintings on the walls, which had once seemed like trophies of a successful life, now appeared more like relics, testaments to a life of solitude, more than one of grandeur. The thought came to her unbidden. Maybe Mr. Graves, too, had reached a point where memories felt like both a comfort and a burden. The longer she pondered, the more she felt an unfamiliar, uncomfortable pull. Like she'd been pulled into a story she hadn't intended to read, but couldn't abandon now. There was something about this reserved, stoic man that made her wonder if the notebook had been left for her to find, as if he'd known she would care enough to read between the lines, to see the loneliness beneath the surface. Her heart ached with a mixture of empathy and curiosity, a need to know the man she'd served all these years. Rosa's heart beat faster as she returned to the study, her mind buzzing with questions and unformed answers. She set the notebook gently on the desk, but couldn't quite bring herself to close it. Each line she had read lingered in her mind, layering her impression of Mr. Graves with more depth than she'd thought possible. As she scanned the study for the last time, her eye caught on something she hadn't noticed before, a small box, half hidden behind a stack of unopened letters. It was slightly tarnished, with edges worn soft as if it had been handled many times. She knew she shouldn't look further. This was, after all, her employer's private space. But the temptation gnawed at her. The notebook had unlocked a curiosity she couldn't suppress, and her instinct told her that whatever lay in that box might explain something, provide an answer to the questions she couldn't stop asking herself. Her hands hovered above the box before she made a quick decision, telling herself she'd only peek. Lifting the lid, she found a small collection of items, a bundle of letters, a pressed flower that had long since lost its color, and a locket with a faint engraving. She carefully unfolded the letters and scanned the first few lines. They were dated decades ago, written by a woman whose words spoke of shared dreams and plans for the future. Rosa's chest tightened as she read, recognizing the same name that had appeared in the notebook, the daughter's name. But these letters were not written by Mr. Graves. They were from someone else, a woman who had signed her name at the bottom with a flowing, graceful hand. The words painted a picture of a life filled with hope, a love that had blossomed and withered, and an aching sense of loss that seemed to echo in Mr. Graves's writings. The woman's words hinted at a past both beautiful and painful, one in which both she and Mr. Graves had shared dreams of a future that somehow had fallen apart. Rosa felt an odd tremor of recognition. It was like reading pieces of a story that resonated with her own. Her heart pounded as she tried to piece it together. This woman, perhaps Mr. Graves's late wife or someone else significant, had written of parting, a separation that sounded involuntary. There was mention of a daughter, their hopes for her, and the life they had dreamed she would lead. Then came a strange phrase that chilled Rosa. If fate ever brings you back to these letters, perhaps it will be because you're ready to see. It was as though these letters, these relics of an unfinished story, had been left deliberately, waiting for the right moment to be found. Suddenly, a memory flared in Rosa's mind, startling in its clarity. Years ago, she'd stumbled across a similar locket in her mother's things. It had belonged to her mother's childhood friend, a woman who had vanished from her life long before Rosa was born. The resemblance was uncanny, and her pulse quickened with the shock of possibility. Could there be a connection here, reaching back through the years? As her fingers closed around the letters, she was filled with a strange sense of purpose. This discovery wasn't just about Mr. Graves anymore. It felt as though it held answers about her own past. It was as if she'd stumbled upon a story written for her, one that might connect her life to his in ways she could scarcely believe. The realization left her both exhilarated and uncertain, as if she were standing on the edge of something profound, a truth that would change her world. Rosa gently returned the letters and closed the box, the weight of her discovery settling heavily on her. The mansion, once just a quiet place of work, now felt like a maze of memories, a puzzle with pieces that, for the first time, seemed to connect her life to that of the man she had only glimpsed from afar. For the rest of the day, Rosa's thoughts whirled, each one grappling with the revelation she'd uncovered. She was torn. caught between the urge to delve deeper and a fierce loyalty that told her to leave the mystery alone. These were Mr. Graves' personal things, his private memories. But now that she'd seen them, touched them, even felt their unspoken weight, the pull to know more was undeniable. As she polished the wide dark desk in his study, her eyes kept darting back to the box, the notebook, and the faded letters she'd put back with trembling hands. She thought of how carefully Mr. Graves had hidden this part of his life, how guarded he had always seemed around her. She'd been just a cleaning woman, someone barely seen, yet here she was with a secret that felt too heavy to carry. Did she have a right to uncover more? And if she did, would it be for his sake or hers? The dilemma nagged at her. She had spent years respecting his privacy, working quietly in the background, content to let his world remain a mystery. But something had shifted. The discovery felt like an invitation, as if Mr. Graves himself, through some unspoken thread, had led her here. And if her suspicions were correct, if there was indeed a tie between her past and his, then maybe the answers she sought were meant for her to find. Rosa's thoughts kept returning to the life she knew. There was a distance, an invisible wall between her and people like Mr. Graves. The difference between their lives had always felt like an unbridgeable gap, like she was meant to observe his world, but never fully understand it. But now that distance was blurred. She could no longer see him as simply a cold, detached figure of wealth and status. There was a pain in those letters and in his journal entries that she recognized, an ache she could feel because she, too, had known loss, loneliness, and the burden of hidden memories. She found herself wondering what kind of man he truly was beneath the polished exterior. Did he still carry the love and loss expressed in those letters? Had he, too, tried to fill the emptiness with work, hiding behind routines as she had once done? The idea unsettled her, yet it was strangely comforting, too. It meant that maybe, beyond the wealth and detachment, Mr. Graves was more human than she'd allowed herself to believe. As she swept her dusting cloth over the familiar surfaces, her fingers grazed the corner of his desk, and for a fleeting moment she could almost feel his presence beside her. She imagined him in those silent, private moments, when the weight of his memories grew too heavy and his solitude too vast. The thought filled her with unexpected empathy, as if her own soul had reached out to his in some unspoken way. Rosa's heart wavered, caught between her loyalty and an insistent curiosity that refused to be silenced. If she walked away now, she would leave the mansion with the faint but certain knowledge that something in her life had changed forever, something she didn't fully understand. And if she stayed, if she let herself explore this connection, she would be stepping beyond her role, intruding on his guarded world, uncovering truths that might change everything. With one last look at the box and the notebook, she exhaled slowly. She would need to decide soon. This secret was no longer just his. It had woven its way into her life, her past, and perhaps her future. As much as she wanted to respect his privacy, she could no longer ignore the feeling that fate had led her to this moment. As Rosa carried out her last tasks, her view of Mr. Graves continued to shift, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time. She'd known the routines, the detached interactions, his polite but distant nods of acknowledgement. She had long assumed that their lives were irreversibly separate, connected only by her labor and his wealth. But the items she'd found, the faded letters, the delicate locket, and the notebook filled with confessions, suggested an entirely different man, someone layered with vulnerability and regret. Her work that afternoon felt heavier, not just because of her impending departure, but because of this new understanding. She thought back to every small interaction with him, every time their paths had crossed briefly. She remembered the time she had witnessed him pausing by the window, looking out over the sprawling grounds as if he were searching for something in the distance. She had brushed it off at the time, dismissing it as nothing more than a moment's distraction. But now, she wondered if that quiet gaze masked a longing, a desire for something he couldn't hold on to, perhaps a love lost, a family fractured, or a life he had once envisioned and somehow lost along the way. For years she had been part of his world, a presence barely noticed in the background. But the revelation made her feel more connected to him, as if some invisible thread bound them. Each room she cleaned took on new meaning. Each piece of furniture, each item left untouched on his desk, held echoes of a story she was only just beginning to understand. Mr. Graves wasn't just an employer or a wealthy figure who passed through her life. He was, in his own way, as human as she was, his wealth no shield against heartache and solitude. Rosa's mind drifted to her own family, to the faded photograph she kept at home of her mother's childhood friend, a woman she'd heard about in passing stories, someone whose path had diverged from her mother's a lifetime ago. Her mother had often mentioned that friend with a wistful look, saying only that they had once been as close as sisters. Now, the memory of that photograph felt almost like an omen, a reminder that lives could intersect in ways both mysterious and unexpected. Could it be possible that Mr. Graves had some connection to her own past? The idea seemed absurd, but the evidence was compelling. Too many details aligned: the name, the locket, the letters that spoke of a child's promise and a life cut short. A sense of purpose began to bloom within her, a feeling that perhaps she was meant to find this, to bridge the gaps not only in his story, but in her own. She had spent her life working quietly, helping others, while her own story had stayed hidden, like an old photograph gathering dust. But now, with each piece of the puzzle she uncovered, she felt as though her world had been thrown open, her life somehow intertwined with his in ways she hadn't dared to imagine. She felt a growing certainty that, on some level, Mr. Graves had left these items for her to find. Perhaps he knew of her connection to his past, or perhaps he sensed in her a kindred spirit, someone who could understand the weight of memories too precious to discard, but too painful to keep in the light. And as she polished the last corner of his desk, her heart ached with the realization that she no longer saw him as simply a millionaire employer, but as a man carrying a weight she understood all too well. As she gathered her cleaning supplies for the last time, a whisper of hope lingered, the feeling that maybe her story with Mr. Graves wasn't over. Her heart felt open, ready for a truth she couldn't yet grasp but felt within her bones. And as she looked one last time around the room, she sensed that whatever lay ahead would bind their lives together in a way she couldn't yet see, but instinctively knew was significant. That evening, Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something unfinished. The mansion's heavy doors had closed behind her for what should have been the last time, but her mind lingered in the study, over the notebook and the letters that had changed everything she thought she knew about Mr. Graves. The next morning, Rosa found herself back on the mansion's steps. She told herself she had only returned to check if she'd forgotten anything. The housekeeper let her in without question, and she made her way straight to the study, her heart racing with anticipation and trepidation. The notebook was where she had left it, the box still half hidden behind the letters. She sat down at the desk, smoothing her hands over its cool surface, willing herself to find the courage to continue. Opening the notebook again, she scanned its pages more carefully, searching for any detail she might have missed. As she turned the pages, she noticed something new. A series of small notes in the margins, written in a different hand. They were faint but distinct, as if someone had left them as breadcrumbs for her to follow. "Remember the promise," one note read, while another said, "Lost, but never forgotten." A chill ran down her spine as she connected the handwriting to the letters she had read the day before. The woman, the one who had written to Mr. Graves all those years ago, had left these marks, hints to guide the reader, or perhaps just herself, through what had been lost. Rosa reached for the box, her fingers brushing the worn metal edges of the locket. This time she dared to open it. Inside was a miniature portrait, painted with delicate strokes, of a young girl who bore a haunting resemblance to Mr. Graves. Her heart thudded painfully as she realized she was looking at the child from his letters, the daughter whose name he had carefully penned with tenderness. The girl's face stirred an ache within her, a sense of familiarity that defied explanation. Then, tucked at the bottom of the box, was a small folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. Rosa opened it carefully, afraid that it might tear under her touch. The headline immediately caught her attention: "Family separated in tragic accident." The story beneath told of a car accident decades ago, a family of 3, torn apart one winter night. The mother and child had been presumed lost, the father left to grieve alone. As she read the details, her mind raced, struggling to grasp the enormity of what this meant. Her mother had told her once, long ago, about a similar incident involving an old friend, a woman who had moved away and vanished from their lives, her fate always a mystery. Rosa hadn't thought much of it at the time, dismissing it as a story lost to time. But the story in this clipping was too similar to ignore. Could it be possible that the woman in the letters, the one whose words spoke of love and loss, was the same friend her mother had spoken of? Rosa's breath caught as a profound realization dawned on her. She hadn't stumbled upon these artifacts by accident. Fate, in some inexplicable way, had guided her here, leading her to uncover a connection that bound her life to Mr. Graves's far more intimately than she could have ever imagined. The little girl in the locket, the daughter who had vanished in tragedy, might have been tied to her family all along. With her pulse racing, Rosa closed the notebook, knowing that her discovery was a doorway she couldn't unsee. Somehow her past and Mr. Graves were woven together, two stories separated by loss and fate, yet reunited in this grand, silent mansion. And she realized, with a certainty that left her shaken, that her role in this mystery was far from over. The revelation hung in Rosa's mind, heavy and surreal. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a dream, caught in the hazy space between reality and memory. Sitting in Mr. Graves' silent study, she tried to absorb the weight of what she had uncovered. Could it truly be that her mother's friend, the woman who had vanished into the folds of history, was the same person who had once shared a life and a daughter with Mr. Graves? She closed her eyes, memories from her childhood flaring into focus, her mother's wistful glances, her voice softened with sorrow as she'd spoken of her lost friend. Rosa could recall fragments of her mother's stories. A dear friend from her youth who had married into wealth, a friend who had vanished after a terrible accident. Her mother had never spoken of her again after that, brushing away questions with an expression Rosa couldn't understand back then. But now, each detail lined up with a clarity that was impossible to deny. Mr. Graves was more than just her distant employer. He was connected to a part of her family's past that had been lost and buried. A pang of empathy filled her as she pictured Mr. Graves's life after that tragedy, forced to carry on with the memories that haunted him, and an emptiness he could never quite fill. She understood now the reason for his quiet, his aloof demeanor that had seemed so cold for so many years. It hadn't been a lack of warmth. It had been a defense, a way to protect himself from the wounds he carried. Yet, Rosa also felt a wave of guilt for having uncovered his secrets without permission. She hadn't meant to invade his privacy, hadn't meant to stumble into a history that belonged to him and those he had lost. And now she felt the weight of having taken a step too far. A mixture of compassion and remorse welled up within her as she considered her next steps. Should she tell him what she had found? Did he deserve to know that his past was tied to hers in such a way? Or should she leave without a word, letting his secrets rest in the silent company of his memories? The decision loomed over her like a shadow, forcing her to confront her own sense of loyalty and morality. Her mind wavered between the urge to confront him with what she had uncovered, to let him know that he was not as alone in the world as he might think, and the instinct to protect his privacy, to let him keep his sorrows safe within the walls he had built. In that moment, she felt a rare kinship with Mr. Graves, a man she had once seen as entirely different from herself. Now, she could see the ways they were alike, both carrying silent burdens, both living with memories that lingered like whispers in quiet rooms. They were two souls who had been connected by fate, their paths crossing in ways neither had anticipated. Rosa knew that this knowledge, this invisible thread binding them together, would remain with her forever. Whatever she chose to do, the revelation had changed her life irreversibly. The world, once so neatly divided into the familiar and the foreign, had blurred. She could no longer look at Mr. Graves and see only her employer. He was a man who had loved, lost, and lived with a heart scarred but still beating. And in some small, surprising way she had become a part of his story, just as he had become a part of hers. Rosa's decision weighed heavily on her, yet deep down, she knew she couldn't leave without speaking to Mr. Graves. Her steps felt slow and heavy as she made her way to the small, dimly lit study where she knew he spent most of his afternoons. She gathered her courage, clutching the notebook in her hands, the object that held the secrets of his past, and, as she now understood, fragments of her own. Mr. Graves looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression unreadable, but his eyes narrowing slightly as he registered the book in her hands. She took a steadying breath, feeling the words catch in her throat. The usual quietness between them, once so comforting, now felt thick with anticipation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching until she could no longer bear it. "Mr. Graves," she began, her voice softer than she intended. I've discovered something I believe you should know." His face remained impassive, though a flicker of tension moved across his brow. "Go on," he said, his voice low and even, as if bracing himself for whatever was to come. Rosa stepped closer, the notebook still clutched in her hands. "I found these in your study," she said quietly, her eyes on the faded letters and worn cover. "And I believe they may be connected to something in my own life. My mother, she once had a dear friend who disappeared under similar circumstances to the ones you wrote about here." For the first time, she saw a crack in his composed demeanor. He leaned back, his gaze sharpening as if he were seeing her anew, sifting through layers of memory. "Your mother?" he repeated slowly, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Who was she?" Rosa swallowed, feeling the significance of the moment press down on her. Her name was Sophia. She spoke of her friend often, though she would never say much after she left. But I remember her words, her regret, her sadness for someone she once considered as close as family. The name seemed to resonate with him. His face softened, and the distance in his gaze dissolved as his eyes filled with something Rosa had never seen before, a deep, raw vulnerability. "Sophia," he murmured almost to himself. "Yes, I remember her. She was dear to her, to both of us." He looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. "That friend, Rosa, she was my wife. She and Sophia were like sisters once. But after the accident, everything fell apart. I lost them both, my wife and my daughter." His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper, as if he were reliving the pain in that very moment. "I tried to put it behind me, to carry on, but some things never leave you." Rosa's heart ached as she listened, her own eyes stinging with unshed tears. In that moment, she saw not the millionaire she had worked for all these years, but a man who had endured a loss so profound it had shaped every corner of his existence. Her own hands trembled as she extended the notebook to him. "Maybe this was meant to be found," she said softly. "Maybe somehow we were meant to uncover this connection, to remember those we lost. I don't think I was meant to just be your cleaning woman, Mr. Graves. I think our paths crossed for a reason." Mr. Graves took the notebook, his fingers brushing against hers for a brief moment. His eyes held hers, no longer filled with the indifferent distance she was used to, but with a recognition that seemed to touch her soul. "Perhaps you're right," he replied, voice raw. "Perhaps we are here now, together, because we both needed to remember, to carry on with the pieces of what we lost." As the weight of his words settled over them, Rosa felt her own heart stir with memories of her mother's wistful stories. The sorrow Mr. Graves carried, now laid bare, resonated deeply within her, filling the silence that had returned between them. Her life, once confined to quiet routines and unnoticed labor, now felt infused with a history she hadn't known was hers. She could sense in his gaze the years of regret, a longing for things undone, words unspoken, moments that had slipped by forever. In that moment, Rosa saw not just the man but the life that had shaped him. And she understood. She, too, had spent years burying her own sorrows beneath daily chores and silent endurance. The pieces of her own life that she had brushed aside now surfaced, finding their place in the shared fabric of loss and love that connected them. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. I think I understand you more now, Mr. Graves, in a way I never thought I could. I've spent years watching others, living in their worlds but never stepping into them. I suppose I've hidden parts of myself too, pretending I was just an onlooker. But we're more alike than I ever imagined." A faint, almost sad smile appeared on his face. "It's strange, isn't it? How life can bring two strangers together and reveal something profound." I've spent decades isolated by choice, surrounded by things that felt more real to me than people." He looked away, as though seeing his own past with new eyes. "But you were there all along, quietly present, bearing witness." Her words took shape with a courage she hadn't expected. "For so long I saw myself as just your employee, a cleaning woman in your grand, distant world. But I see now that there's value in what I do, in who I am. And that, somehow, we shared something all this time without even knowing it." The realization that had dawned in Rosa's heart was as surprising as it was empowering. She'd spent so much of her life shrinking away from connection, accepting the quiet role she thought fate had given her. But she now felt a powerful sense of identity, a conviction that she was more than an invisible presence in other people's lives. Her role had not been simply to clean the rooms of the mansion, but to share in the lives of those within it, to find, in her own quiet way, a bridge to connection. As she looked at Mr. Graves, she saw his acknowledgement, his acceptance of her as something more than just part of the background. The years of work had bound them in ways neither had realized, creating a bridge between lives once divided by circumstance and class. And as much as she had learned from him, she felt that her presence, her loyalty, her quiet understanding had perhaps offered him a solace he hadn't known he needed. In that shared moment, Rosa felt a sense of completeness she hadn't felt in years. Life, with all its complexity, its invisible connections and unspoken meanings, was unfolding before her. The simplicity of her days, the quiet resilience she'd worn like armor, now felt like strengths, not weaknesses. She'd come to Mr. Graves' mansion for work, but she was leaving with something far more valuable, a realization of her worth, her ability to touch lives even in the smallest of ways. Her gaze softened as she met his eyes, and in that look, they shared an understanding, an unspoken promise to carry forward the stories they had uncovered together. She rose to leave, a quiet yet unshakable confidence within her, carrying with her not just memories but a newfound sense of self, a feeling that her life too held meaning far beyond the walls she had once felt defined by. Rosa took a steady breath, glancing one last time around the study that had revealed so many secrets. Her heart was heavy with the knowledge of how much this space held, not just as a place of work, but as a keeper of memories, sorrows, and even traces of love. The small notebook rested on the desk where she had left it, and Mr. Graves sat quietly, his gaze cast downward as though lost in reflection. This was it, the final goodbye. Before Rosa turned to leave, Mr. Graves rose, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. He reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out something small and shiny, its edges glinting in the dim light. In his hand, she saw the locket, the one she had found nestled among the letters and mementos, the one that held the painted portrait of his lost daughter. He held it out to her, his hand slightly trembling, his face softened by something like vulnerability. "This," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "was hers. I kept it because it was all I had left of her. I've carried it like a reminder of everything I lost that night." His gaze met hers, the sorrow in his eyes unmistakable yet mingling with a quiet strength. "And now it feels like maybe you should have it." Rosa blinked, stunned by the gesture. "Mr. Graves, I can't take this. It's yours, and it's a piece of her." He shook his head slowly. "No, Rosa, it's more than just a memory of her. It's a reminder of connections I thought were lost, connections I let myself forget, and now it feels like it's come full circle." He placed the locket in her hand, closing her fingers around it. "This locket belongs with someone who remembers her, even if it's only through what she's left behind." A surge of emotion welled up inside Rosa as she held the delicate locket, its warmth pulsing against her palm. She looked at Mr. Graves, understanding that this was his way of saying thank you, a gesture that went beyond words. They had been two strangers, tied by nothing more than work and circumstance, but somehow the mansion's silent walls had held a bridge to each other's lives. And now, with this small but profound gesture, he was giving her a token of trust, a symbol of everything they had shared without speaking. Rosa stepped back, clutching the locket, the tiny weight in her hand feeling like a part of the past she hadn't known was hers until now. She thought of her mother, of the long-ago friendship that had once bound their families. She thought of the lost daughter she had never met, but now felt a connection to. the love and grief held within the quiet walls of this mansion. And as she looked at Mr. Graves one last time, she saw more than just a wealthy man bearing the scars of loss. She saw someone who, despite everything, had found a moment of peace in their shared understanding. "Thank you, Mr. Graves," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion, "for trusting me with this, and for everything, I think." She paused, gathering herself. "I think I understand you now, more than I ever thought I could." He gave her a slight nod, his face softened by something like a rare smile, a glimmer of the man he might have been once. "And thank you, Rosa, for seeing me, for being here all these years and helping me remember what I'd lost." His voice broke slightly, but he steadied himself, adding, "You were more than a presence in these halls. You became a part of them, and I'll carry that with me." With a quiet nod, Rosa turned, feeling the finality of the moment settle within her. She walked through the mansion one last time, her footsteps soft, her gaze lingering over the polished surfaces, the quiet rooms, the memory-laden corners. This place had been her sanctuary, her source of income, and a mystery that had somehow intertwined with her life. She had come here to work, but she was leaving with something much more, a piece of her own past uncovered, a sense of shared humanity, and a respect that transcended wealth or title. As she stepped out into the sunlight, Rosa closed her hand around the locket, feeling its warmth against her skin. She understood now that life had brought her here not only to serve, but to learn, to discover hidden truths and to find, within herself, a strength she hadn't known. She was ready to carry these memories forward, grateful for the life she had lived within those walls and the quiet gift of understanding she had received. And as she walked away, her heart felt lighter, her spirit lifted by the knowledge that sometimes the most profound connections arise in the unlikeliest places. As Rosa left the mansion's grounds, a mixture of sorrow and hope filled her heart. The grand building, once so impersonal and cold, had become a place where she'd found unexpected meaning. Connections she hadn't known were there, and pieces of her past she hadn't known were lost. The locket lay heavy in her pocket, its small weight a tangible reminder of everything she had uncovered, both about Mr. Graves and about herself. She knew she would carry the memory of him, of their quiet yet profound connection, for the rest of her life. The following days passed in a haze of reflection and newfound clarity. Rosa spent time sorting through her memories, placing her time at the mansion within a larger story that now held significance she could never have anticipated. She thought about her mother's stories of her friend, the way she'd left parts of her past unspoken. It seemed now as though Rosa had been guided by more than just routine or necessity. It felt like fate had placed her in that mansion to uncover her family's own hidden legacy. With each day that passed, Rosa felt a quiet strength growing within her. She realized that her time at the mansion had been more than just years of labor. It had been a journey of silent learning, a path of resilience she had walked alone, but that had led her to this transformative moment. The sorrow she'd felt when leaving the mansion now settled into a more profound understanding. She saw her work not as invisible toil, but as something essential, something that had given her the power to connect deeply, even across the walls of status and wealth. Holding the locket each night, Rosa would trace the engraved edges, allowing the memories of Mr. Graves and his long-lost family to settle into her heart. The object became a symbol, not of loss alone, but of resilience, of her own and Mr. Graves' abilities to carry the weight of their histories forward. She began to feel that her story, too, was worthy of being remembered, shared, and honored. With a new sense of purpose, Rosa started to take steps toward what she could only describe as a fresh beginning. She reached out to the few family members who still remembered the stories her mother had shared, piecing together the details that had become blurred over the years. Slowly, she reconstructed a narrative that wove her family's legacy with Mr. Graves' story, a tale of friendship, loss, and resilience that spanned generations. And through this process, Rosa found herself reflecting on her own worth, on how her life, too, held value beyond the quiet, unseen work she had done. Soon, she began thinking of ways to honor her experiences, perhaps even share them with others. She realized that others, too, carried unspoken stories within them, stories of hidden strength, of family legacies, of lives that had intertwined in the shadows of larger events. She felt a new calling, a pull to connect with others who, like herself, had been silent witnesses to life's quiet but profound moments. With the small savings she had accumulated over the years, Rosa began volunteering at a local community center, offering support to those in need. She found herself listening to people's stories, seeing reflections of her own journey in their words. She shared her experiences too, not always directly, but in ways that reminded others of the power in resilience, in finding meaning in life's quiet corners. She no longer felt defined by the quiet roles she had taken. Rather, she embraced the depth and importance of her experiences. One afternoon, as she held the locket once more, Rosa felt a deep sense of peace. The mansion had been part of her life, and so, too, had Mr. Graves and his hidden sorrows. She was grateful for the time she had spent there, for the work she had done, and for the shared understanding she had found with a man she might have otherwise never known. Their paths had crossed not by accident, but by something deeper, something that tied lives together, even across silence and solitude. The years she had spent working within those walls had changed her, had taught her that even in the quietest roles, there was a value that transcended wealth or recognition. And now, as she prepared to move forward, Rosa knew that her life, too, was a story worth sharing, worth living fully. She carried with her a legacy of resilience, of quiet strength, and a newfound belief that life's most profound connections often came without warning, binding us to others in ways we might never see, until the moment arrives when we are finally ready to understand. Months passed, and Rosa's life settled into a new rhythm. Yet, in quiet moments, her mind would drift back to that last day at the mansion, to the time spent in Mr. Graves's study, where her own history had intertwined so unexpectedly with his. Her new life felt full of purpose, but the mansion, with its echoing halls and unspoken secrets, lingered in her memory like an unfinished sentence. She would sometimes pause, mid-task, caught by the sense that part of her still walked those quiet corridors, moving through rooms rich with the weight of shared memories. One evening, Rosa found herself at home, holding the locket Mr. Graves had given her, its metallic coolness grounding her as she traced its edges. The image inside was faded, but still distinct, the young girl's eyes as haunting as the day she had first seen them. She had wondered often about Mr. Graves since leaving the mansion, about what he had done with the quiet spaces of his life after she left. She wondered if he, too, had found comfort in the knowledge of their shared connection, if their moment of vulnerability had brought him some measure of peace. Their exchange had been brief, yet she knew it had carved a lasting mark on both their lives. The locket became a symbol for her, not just of the past, but of the journey she had walked, the history she had uncovered and embraced. It served as a reminder that the lives of others, even those who seemed distant and detached, often held echoes of her own. In the girl's eyes, she saw innocence mixed with sadness, a vulnerability that bridged generations and spoke to her of a shared humanity that crossed beyond roles, wealth, or privilege. Rosa thought often of her mother's stories about her friend, the wistful memories she'd shared in fragments over the years. And as she now understood, those memories were Rosa's inheritance, passed down not as objects but as whispers of a time filled with friendship and loss. Her mother's memories, now entangled with her own, were richer, more complete, as though they had been waiting for Rosa to unlock the missing piece. In a way, Rosa felt she had fulfilled a part of her family's legacy by unearthing these hidden connections. The mansion's influence, subtle yet profound, touched her daily life in ways she hadn't anticipated. She found herself noticing details she'd overlooked before, becoming more attuned to the people around her. She'd learned to see beneath the surfaces of others, to recognize quiet struggles and hidden strengths that lay within everyone she met. Her life, once quiet and predictable, now held a depth that made each day feel meaningful. Her interactions with others layered with a gentle empathy and a desire to offer understanding. The community center where she now volunteered had become a place of solace, a space where she could listen, support, and connect with others. Each person's story seemed to echo a small part of her own journey, reminding her that life was full of unexpected connections. Rosa's presence there brought a calming strength, and the people she helped came to look forward to her gentle company, her listening ear, her willingness to share the parts of her story that felt universal. In quiet moments at the center, she would take out the locket and let its presence remind her of everything she had uncovered. She found strength in knowing that, through her time at the mansion, she had discovered not only her own worth, but the worth in everyone she met, regardless of their wealth or status. She now viewed the locket as a guide, a small, shining reminder to look beyond first impressions, to recognize the invisible stories that each person carried. Rosa sometimes imagined Mr. Graves in his mansion, perhaps holding a memory as she did, perhaps finding a bit of peace in knowing their lives had crossed in such a unique way. She felt certain that he, too, had been transformed by their shared revelation, and though they had parted ways, she sensed that they would always carry a quiet understanding of each other. As she moved forward, Rosa found peace in carrying this symbol of her past, embracing the power of her family's legacy and the unexpected bond she had formed with Mr. Graves. It served as a reminder of the countless lives that touched her own, a testament to the subtle ways in which we shape and are shaped by others. And as she looked back, she saw her journey with Mr. Graves not as a simple encounter with a wealthy employer, but as a deep, intricate connection that had given her life new purpose and understanding. In the months that followed, Rosa continued to find herself drawn to stories, not only of her past, but of others who had crossed her path. Her work at the community center grew from a simple pastime into something deeply fulfilling. Each day brought new faces, each with their own tales of resilience, struggle, and joy. She discovered in herself an unexpected talent for connecting with people, for making them feel seen and heard, just as Mr. Graves had made her feel when he'd shared his vulnerable story with her. One afternoon, as she guided a group of young volunteers through their duties, one of them, a shy girl who reminded Rosa of her own younger self, pulled her aside. "Miss Rosa," she began hesitantly, "how did you become like this?" She gestured vaguely, struggling to put her thoughts into words. "You know, kind of like someone who understands things, like life things." Rosa chuckled softly, warmed by the girl's innocence and sincerity. She thought about how to answer, realizing that everything she'd been through, from her years working in the mansion to her unexpected connection with Mr. Graves, had contributed to the sense of wisdom the girl perceived. "Life has a way of teaching us things when we least expect it," she replied gently. "Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, the ones we don't think are important, that we learn the most. And sometimes," she added with a small smile, "the people who seem the farthest from us turn out to be the ones who teach us the most." The girl nodded, though she might not yet understand the weight of Rosa's words. But Rosa knew that one day she would. Perhaps, when her own life had given her unexpected lessons, she would look back and remember the quiet wisdom of a woman who had once been just a cleaning lady, but had learned, through silence and solitude, the value of a shared heart. As Rosa left the community center that evening, she paused by the old oak tree outside, its branches heavy with autumn leaves. She reached into her pocket, feeling the familiar warmth of the locket's metal against her fingers. She opened it once more, gazing at the portrait of Mr. Graves' daughter, the face that had started her journey into the past. She felt a deep sense of connection to this child, the life she had never met yet, whose memory had forever changed her. Rosa closed the locket with a gentle snap, its soft click settling like a heartbeat against her hand. She understood now that life didn't always offer clear answers or neatly tied endings. Some mysteries, like the full story of Mr. Graves and her mother's friend, would remain partially obscured, their meanings meant to linger in quiet contemplation rather than demand resolution. She knew she would never fully understand the extent of their bond, nor why their paths had crossed in such a mysterious, profound way. But the unspoken connections, the unanswered questions, were part of the beauty, a reminder that life held depths she would spend her whole life exploring. With the locket nestled back in her pocket, Rosa turned her gaze toward the horizon, her steps purposeful as she made her way home. Her life, once marked by routines and quiet service, now held a richness, a new direction shaped by everything she had experienced. She no longer saw herself as just an observer in the lives of others. She was a participant, a storyteller in her own right, carrying forward the lessons she had learned in a way that honored her own worth and the worth of those who had come before her. Rosa had found peace not only in understanding the value of her own life, but in embracing the mysteries that had shaped it. She moved forward with a sense of wholeness, a quiet but steady confidence, ready for whatever paths lay ahead. Each day was no longer just a repetition of the last, but a chance to uncover new stories, to connect with others, and to leave a legacy of compassion and understanding. And as she walked, Rosa felt a renewed sense of purpose, a spark of hope that she had discovered not only her own strength, but the strength of all those whose lives had touched hers. She knew now that her journey would never truly end. It would continue through every person she met, every story shared, and every quiet moment of understanding. With a heart open to life's mysteries and a spirit emboldened by her newfound self-worth, Rosa stepped into the evening light, embracing a future filled with possibility, wisdom, and the quiet magic of shared humanity.